Good evening and welcome to RJ Julia Booksellers and Wesleyan RJ Julia Bookstores virtual event featuring the great Harvey Araton. We are so excited to have you all with us this evening. Before we get started, just a few quick Zoom housekeeping details for you. Please ask questions using the chat box function of your Zoom screen. We're going to get to as many of your questions as we can later in the evening, and though you will remain muted throughout the duration of the event, an RJ Julia staff member is monitoring the chat box, so send them on over. For optimal viewing, you can use Zoom view functions in the top right corner of your screen and select speaker view, which will allow the speaking author to remain highlighted throughout the duration of the event. If at any point throughout tonight's event you should get disconnected, simply re-click the link that was sent to you in an email earlier today, and we will readmit you into our event this evening. And of course, don't forget to purchase your copy of Our Last Season, A Writer, a Fan, a Friendship. Links for book purchases will be sent to you in your Zoom chat box, and signed book plates are available while supplies last. So let's get started, shall we? Tonight we have a great treat in store for you all. We are thrilled to welcome to the virtual stage Harvey Araton, one of New York's and the nation's best-known sports journalists. Harvey worked for 25 years at the New York Times, to which he still contributes. He is the author or co-author of several books, including Driving Mr. Yogi, which was a New York Times bestseller. His book, When the Garden Was Eden, was made into an ESPN 30 for 30 documentary, which Harvey co-produced. In 2017, he received the Kurt Gowdy Media Award from the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, and tonight joins us to discuss his newest book, Our Last Season. In conversation with Harvey this evening, we are so pleased to have with us Richard Kent, practicing attorney and partner at the law firm of Myers, Briner, and Kent in Fairfield, Connecticut. Mr. Kent has authored numerous articles on family law and has tried over 100 cases. Mr. Kent is also a professional sports writer and author. He is a member of the United States Basketball Writers of America and the United States Tennis Writers of America. So without further ado, please give a warm digital screen welcome to Harvey Araton and Richard Kent. Take it away, Richard.
Hey, Harvey, good evening. How are you?
I'm fine, Richard. It's great to be here.
Harvey, tell us a bit about the premise of the book, because it's not your classic sports book. It's not your classic standalone human interest book. It's kind of a combo of the two.
Yeah, well, I reached a point in 2016 where I left the New York Times staff and left daily journalism after, I would say, close to 4 decades working for 4 different newspapers. Literally, I started out of high school while I was in college working for the Staten Island Advance, where I grew up. So when you get to a point where, you suddenly have, this freedom after so many years of being told by editors, go to the Knicks game, go to the tennis tournament, go to the Giants football game, writing, for a specific audience about famous people in the news, suddenly, as I entered sort of the freelance life, I felt like I had this opportunity to explore different subjects and perhaps go in a direction I hadn't gone before. And also, I think when you reach a certain point in your career where you're stepping down from what defined you, how you defined yourself for so long, you start to take inventory of your career and your life. And I think all those things together, combined with the fact that the woman who is I would call her the star of this book, and myself as the lesser star, but all those things combined made me want to explore what I had considered an incredibly unique and special friendship in my life, my friendship with Michelle Musler, the woman who was behind the Knicks bench for 45 years as a fan, and I was sitting a few feet away at the press table. And we forged this friendship, which started out essentially for myself as one of self-interest where, she was literally my eyes and ears behind the bench. I was a young, insecure beat reporter for the New York Post. And ultimately, the friendship grew into something much more important in my life. She became, I don't like to call her a surrogate parent, but really that's that wise elder that I really needed, that I didn't have in my own family. Someone who really took an interest in my career and understood journalism. And so the quick story on the moment that I knew I really wanted to write the book was I happened to write Michelle's obituary in the New York Times. She was known by many of the journalists, and she appeared in a lot of sports columns in New York in the papers as that, so in many ways, the price of the voice of the price gouged fan. And so when I pitched after she passed away, and I don't think I'm giving away the ending to the book, but after she passed away in 2018, I pitched an obit to the New York Times obituaries editor, and he thought it was kind of a cool story, a woman who sat behind the bench for that long, and it was sort of like the flip side of Spike Lee. I mean, Spike is the face of Knicks fans. Michelle was sort of like what I like to call the non-celebrity. She was a non-celebrity fan. And so I got the go-ahead, and in writing it, in preparing to write it, I had to do some reporting. So I called up Jeff Van Gundy, and who was always one of Michelle's favorites there. And I called him up, and this was right after the NBA Finals had ended in June of 2018. And I said to him, we chatted about the finals, and I said, Jeff, the reason why I'm calling is because remember when you coached in New York, there was a woman who sat behind the bench. And before I said another word, he stopped me and said, "You mean Michelle?" And I said, "Yeah." And it hit me when he said that. Here was a guy who hadn't coached in New York for 17 or 18 years, maybe 19 years. I think he left in 2001. And then he'd gone on to coach the Houston Rockets. And then he'd gone on to become a highly respected national broadcaster. And here it is at the, just mentioning that woman behind the bench, her name was still at the tip of his tongue. And it hit me in that moment that not only was Michelle someone who had made a great impact in my life, but she apparently had made the same kind of impact with many other people. And so in that moment, maybe in the days after, the more I thought about it, I really wanted to write this book, not only because I thought it was a great story and a personal story that I had to tell, but also because I wanted to write this tribute book to a woman who I thought was extraordinary, whose personal life and triumph over tremendous, really difficult odds as a young girl, as a divorced mother with 5 young children to raise on her own, as a woman who, climbed the corporate ladder and ultimately had her own consulting company and executive training, traveled all around the world. It made me really want to write this as a tribute to someone who had made such a great impact on my life.
How did she get interested in the Knicks and in the NBA?
Well, she was something of a tomboy growing up. She grew up in Hartford, and she grew up in a working class family. And she had a younger brother who apparently was a pretty good basketball player. And Michelle had no interest in playing with dolls or anything like that. And she used to trail after him to the schoolyard, and he would scream at her, "Get lost, what are you doing following me around?" But she was pretty insistent that she had developed a real interest in basketball. And in high school, now this would be the late 1940s, early 1950s, Michelle became the sports editor of her high school newspaper, which was a pretty neat trick in those days. And she actually harbored fantasies, aspirations, whatever you want to call them, of being a sports journalist. But of course, in those days, there was no pathway into sports journalism for a female. And so, she got married, she went to college, got a degree. She got married, had 5 kids in less than a decade. The marriage crashed and burned. Her husband left her with those 5 children, as I mentioned earlier. She She had to pick up the pieces. There were a lot of hard financial times for her and her children. But one of the things that she got a job as an intern one summer at Xerox in Stanford, where she lived. And that kind of opened the door into a career in human resources for a bunch of different corporations. But one of the things that I guess it was like early on, where someone offered her a corporate ticket to go to a Knicks game, and it was down close to the court, and she just fell in love with that whole environment. And that's where she kind of rebuilt her social life. She sort of assimilated that world at Madison Square Garden. She made friends with a lot of the wives and girlfriends of the players, the team executives. And, she felt like she no longer fit in suburbia as a divorced mother of 5 kids. And so New York was a place she couldn't afford to move, because how could she afford enough space to move 5 children into an apartment? But she sort of reconstructed her social life around basketball and the Garden.
You're a pretty knowledgeable guy about the Knicks, and you characterized her as your eyes and ears. I mean, how did she pull that off? How did she infiltrate the team? How did she get signals from coaches and the like?
Well, first of all, she was sitting literally in the first row behind the bench. So in the years of, let's say, Hubie Brown, who was known to berate his players, we were on the other side of the court at that time in those earliest years. And so Michelle was someone who was looking right into the team huddle. She was there, and she didn't have to read lips. She could hear them. And so she knew which players were ticked off when they got pulled out of a game. She knew which players were being, yelled at by the coach. And after the game, she would head down to the old bar, Charlie O's, which was in the Garden building on 8th Avenue. On 33rd Street. And she would be sitting with the wives and girlfriends, and she would hear all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes. Often in those days, I was the reporter for the Post, and the Post was, in the first 2 or 3 years that I was working as the Knicks reporter, we were strictly an afternoon paper. So I could outlast my newspaper colleagues, the opposition from the other papers, in the locker room. And then I could file my story at 4 o'clock in the morning if I chose. So I would head down to the bar, and I would meet Michelle, and we would exchange information. She was so fascinated by, she wanted to know like which players, were upset after the game, and what was being said by the coaches, and what I had learned and what would be in the next day's paper, because she had this love for sports journalism and journalism, in total as well, but particularly for, what the basketball writers were doing. And in turn, she would fill me in on everything she had heard. It got to the point, Richard, where she actually tipped me off. She would hear things from the wives of a couple of players, and she would say, so-and-so told me that the Knicks are going to sign Ray Williams to a new contract, or I actually broke the story of the Knicks signing Bernard King as a free agent. I think it was in 1982, maybe 83. Anyway, that was Michelle's tip. She had a source. I assume it was a wife, and if the wife of a player was telling Michelle something, then I had to assume it was coming from the player, and assume that the player was hearing it from his agent. The agents always knew what was going on behind the scenes. So of course I would then take that information and make the required calls to the agents or the PR people and confirm what she was telling me before I put it into print. But there were several times, particularly in those early years before I had developed my own sources at the Garden, where Michelle was my primary source.
Are there any life parallels that you and Michelle shared that really helped bond you two?
I think what she recognized in me more than I would have in her at the time, because I think in the early years, Michelle was, I always said she was the best listener I've ever known, which I think was why she was so good at her chosen career in human resources. She really had great reads on people. And of course, that's why she loved sitting behind the bench. It wasn't so much that she was an X's and O basketball person. She loved the human drama of the game and the way the players responded to the pressure and all that. But I would say that in the early days of our friendship, that she saw in me similarities of her own childhood. You know, I grew up in working class family in public housing in Staten Island, New York. And, you know, I never actually planned on a career in journalism. It was somewhat serendipitous. Somebody I knew asked me if I was interested in working at the Staten Island Advance, as essentially doing gopher work when I was 18 years old. And one thing led to another. And at one point I realized, hey, maybe I could make a go of this as a career while I was going to college. But I think she grew up in public housing in Hartford. And there were financial struggles. There was some strange, peculiar circumstances in her family life. I think she sensed in me someone who was ultra competitive to move beyond the kind of family careers, the careers that most of my family and relatives had gone into. And yet at the same time, she sensed a lot of insecurities that I didn't know whether I had the goods, and you know, I doubted myself. And I think she kind of took me on as like a personal project in some ways to help build up my confidence and be sort of a one-person support group for me.
Now, you almost didn't take the New York Times job, but for your conversation with Michelle at one point in time. Is that correct?
Yeah, you know, again, you know, in the book, I talk about, in a very loving way, that my father, who was a postal worker, and he loved the fact that his son worked for the New York Post and the Daily News. He wasn't a real sports fan, and nor was he all that much interested in sports journalism. But, you know, he loved, you know, they lived in Brooklyn after the years in Staten Island, and he loved walking down the avenue and going into the butcher shop, and the guy behind the counter saying, you know, what the hell is your son, you know, writing about Bernard King or Larry Bird. And he loved seeing my little photo atop the columns in the tabloids. And so the Daily News in 1990, in late 1990, we were on strike for 5 months. And during that strike, my father died a few months earlier. And during that strike, I was negotiating with the Times. And when the strike ended, the Times offered me a job. And when the time came to actually accept it, I mean, logically, it made all the sense in the world. And, you know, it was a step up in salary and in stature. And but I was really having trouble pulling the trigger on accepting the job, because I felt like it was something that my father wouldn't have wanted me to do. He would have, you know, and you know, I was still in mourning of his loss. And it was Michelle. I remember I formally accepted the job, and I'd gone out to Long Island to interview Chris Mullin when he'd come in with the Golden State Warriors. And as I was driving into the city, back into the city to go write my first story at the Times, it also happened to be the first day that the New York Daily News staff was returning after the strike. And I found myself, you know, wanting to go back to the paper that my father read, you know, every day. And it was I think it was just a combination of everything that had happened: the strike, his death, the birth of my first child, my first son, 7 months before my father died. And I just parked behind the Daily News, and I sat there for about a half hour, you know, kind of immobilized. And then I went to a payphone and I called up Michelle, and it was sort of like an alcoholic calling his sponsor, needing to get in touch with someone who could, you know, help me figure out exactly what was the best thing for me. And we talked for about 20 minutes on the phone. I kept pouring quarters into the phone. And in the way that Michelle always provided this wise counsel, she convinced me that the right thing to do was to move on with my life and take the job at the Times.
Let's get down and dirty in some of the basketball stuff. She had some real definite feelings about Jim Dolan, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, well, in writing a book like this, you're always trying to figure out, trying to tell a story that's not so much about basketball per se, right? It's the thing that brought us together and sort of cemented our friendship. And it was a constant in our friendship throughout no matter what, we had Sunday was usually our day to catch up by phone after the news shows were over, which she religiously watched. And I would call her and we would talk about any number of things, family, struggles, crises, but ultimately it came back to the Knicks, right? But anyway, you're writing a book about this friendship with a woman who sat behind the Knicks bench for 45 years, the last 18 of which came during the Jim Dolan era. There is no way to actually do this book without devoting a chapter to Jim Dolan and the havoc he wrought at the Garden with this, down on its luck franchise. And, she sat right behind the bench, and Dolan's seat, particularly in the reconfigured garden, in the reconstructed garden from, I'd say, like 2011 through 2018, which was Michelle's last season going to the games. So she, got a good view of him slumped in his seat in what she called the worst posture of any executive she'd ever laid eyes on. And she would, she knew what was going on from what she read in the papers and what I told her, the sort of the reign of terror that Dolan's years as the chairman of the Garden has been. And she fantasized about working. This is what she did for a living. She would, some company like Procter & Gamble would hire her to fly to Jakarta and work with someone in one of their international offices who was having difficulty relating to his staff or hitting on all the secretaries or whatever it was. And it was her job to go in and essentially, shape this person up. So she fantasized about having the opportunity to do that with Dolan. She even once came close to calling David Stern, whom she knew, and asking, please intercede in my behalf and let me work with Jim. I think I can help him be a better chairman of the Garden. And, the reward for me is that maybe I'll see a damn good basketball team before I die. So, of course, she didn't do it. She enjoyed fantasizing. One night we were having dinner, and the last couple of years that, especially the last year of her life, we had actually talked about possibly doing a book. I don't think we were all that serious about it because, a book is work, and why let work get in the way of a wonderful friendship? But I was recording our dinner conversations, and she went over point by point of what she would have done to help shape Dolan up. And I think that chapter, I think it's called Dolan and the Death of Hope, is one of my favorites in the book because it really captures Michelle and the insights she had into a pretty complex man. It's not like she hated him. She didn't know him personally. And that really wasn't the way she related to players or coaches or owners. She looked at him as a professional curiosity, and that's what comes across in that chapter.
Why do you think it's been 47 years since the Knicks have won a championship?
Well, I think, if I had to, underline one particular reason, it's because the Garden's ownership has always been this kind of cold corporate and ever evolving, just epic of different personalities. You don't get an Abe Pollin who was the owner of the Washington Bullets / Wizards for like 50 years. You don't get a Mark Cuban who, buys the Dallas Mavericks and turns it into something that defines him beyond the wealth of how he built his wealth. You get this corporate structure, and you get people who are always questioning, what their job security is, who's actually calling the shots in ownership, what the goals are. And as a result, the Garden, more than any team that I ever was around, and I was a general sports columnist at the Times and the Daily News, so I covered, baseball and football and not so much hockey, but all the major team sports for the most part. I've never seen such a cutthroat organization as I have in all my years around the Garden, and it goes back long before Dolan. And a lot of it, and I talked about this in the book with Michelle. So I'll give you for instance, when the Knicks hired Al Bianchi to be their general manager in the late 80s, they hired him, and then they said, we're getting on a plane and we're flying to Providence, and we're hiring Rick Pitino as coach. And Al Bianchi was an NBA lifer and a New York guy who had waited a lot of years in his post-playing career to become the general manager of a team. Now here he is, suddenly he's hired in his native to run his, the New York Knicks of his native New York, and he's beside himself with joy. The first thing they tell him is, we're choosing your coach for you. As a result, he wanted to hire Larry Brown or another more veteran, experienced coach. As a result, they hired Pitino, who was a hot young guy, who was really ambitious, and the two of them never trusted one another. So after a year and a half of success, they were at each other's throats. Pitino left, used the visibility of the New York stage to get the job at Kentucky, and the team kind of went downhill, and Bianchi got fired. And this kind of story has repeated itself over and over again through the years. Hubie Brown and Dave DeBusschere were an odd couple. Pitino and Al Bianchi. Ernie Grunfeld and Jeff Van Gundy were at each other's throats. On and on. Even Phil Jackson, when he came here to coach the Knicks, somehow Steve Mills remained as the general manager because Jim Dolan liked him. So right away, inside the organization, Phil Jackson is dealing with someone who's not a loyalist. It goes on and on that way. And as a result, one administration's mistakes bleed into the next administration. And they wind up, look at the current team, that the management that preceded the current one, this new one, traded Kristaps Porzingis for no good reason at all. And here you had a guy who happened to turn out to be a really, good draft pick. I don't think he's a superstar in the sense, in the realm of let's say even the guy he's playing with in Dallas, Luka Doncic, but he's a really good number 2 star. And they traded him for essentially nothing. And now you have them starting to build from scratch. How much better would that young team look if it had Kristaps Porzingis still on it? So I think that's that was a long answer, I know, but to the corporate structure and the lack of one continuous presence who gives the team a feel, an operating style, and also a personality.
Michelle had a real fondness for Bernard King, and she really wanted him to play at some point with Patrick Ewing. Can you talk about those two personalities as they relate to Michelle?
Well, again, yeah. Michelle and I used to talk a lot about, who our favorite players were, whether it was league-wide or, our favorite Knicks. And I think we pretty much, I think she would have, I would have always chosen Walt Frazier as, the greatest Knick of all time. I think she believed it was Willis Reed, but we both agreed that the most exciting Knick that we had ever seen, certainly the most exciting player I covered, because I didn't cover, I'm not I'm not old enough to have covered, the championship teams. I was in high school and college during those years. But we agreed that the most exciting, the most electric player, the most explosive player, albeit for a relatively brief period before he blew out his knee, was Bernard King. And what made him so compelling was not just the way he played, the sort of the explosiveness of his ability to get up and down the court, and that turnaround jump shot from the baseline, which the ball almost seemed to be leaving his hands before they touched his hands. That's how quick he was with the release. But the game face, he was known for, he'd walk on the court with this like really, angry look. And, it scared the hell out of all of us at courtside. I have to admit that. And so the last year that Michel was alive, I got a call from a bookstore in Maplewood, New Jersey, from a guy I know down there. And he asked me to do a Q&A with Bernard, who had just released an autobiography. And so I said, sure, I'll read the book. And I did the Q&A with Bernard. And after it was over, after I read the book, the first call I made was to Michel, and I said, now I know where the game face comes from. And she said, tell me, because she'd been watching him. She had watched him for those, 3 years that he was the Knicks' best player. And she always felt, again, from, her fascination with the personalities and the life stories that were behind the players. She always thought, she used to tell me, there's something behind that game face that I think would be compelling if he would ever reveal what it was. And it turned out in the book, he talked about it. His mother used to beat him, and to steel himself and to not let on to her that she was causing him pain. He developed this look of this hard, cold look. And then after his years where he struggled with alcohol and drugs, and he cleaned up his act and he became a superstar, he used that game face to or that mentality to psych himself up before a game and try to intimidate opponents. But that was the story behind it. Michel was beside herself with joy that he had actually finally, revealed where that came from. But we both we both said that, it's sad that he tore up his knee at the end of a season. I think it was in '85. It was a lost season. Bill Cartwright was injured. They weren't going anywhere. Bernard was the only attraction, the only good player on the team. And they were heading into the lottery. And in what was a meaningless game in Kansas City on a Saturday night, near the end of the game, trying to block a shot, he tore up his knee, tore the ligaments, broke a bone. In those days, that was a much more serious injury than it is now. And he was out for almost 2 years. Months after he injured himself, the Knicks won the first NBA lottery, which was the Patrick Ewing lottery. By the time Bernard came back for the final 6 games 2 years later, Patrick was out with tendonitis. And then after that season, they hired, as I mentioned, Bianchi and Pitino. Pitino didn't believe that Bernard, coming off knee surgery, could play in his up-tempo trap pressing style. And so they cut him loose as a free agent. And sadly, and again, it's sort of like in part of that sort of tortured Knick history, Ewing and Bernard King never played a minute together as a Knick.
Now, she really felt that Pat Riley was a majestic human being as well as a majestic coach. Can you talk about the Pat Riley situation as it related to Michel and your relationship with Michel?
Well, my favorite Pat Riley story, his first year with the Knicks, he came to New York as a certified championship coach. He had the whole Armani look. And remember, those Knicks teams in the 90s, Patrick Ewing Knicks, they didn't have Patrick is obviously a Hall of Fame player, but they didn't have one of the transcendent Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson type players, the real charismatic, Nike champions. And so when Riley came to New York, he became that person. He became the face of the team, even though he's just a coach. And one of the first nights, one of the first games that season at home happened to be the day that Magic Johnson announced in LA that he had contracted HIV. And the news broke like a thunderclap, right? And the Knicks were playing the Orlando Magic that night. And before the game, Riley walked out to center court and he grabbed the mic and he essentially had us all in the palm of his hand. I mean, Pat could be a majestic speaker. He probably made a lot of money doing corporate speaking. I know he did, actually. And he gave this speech that was just incredible, so heartfelt, because he had been obviously very close to Magic. And at one point, I kind of looked over my right shoulder. I was sitting, there was always like about 5 or 6 press seats right next to the Knicks bench, and I was sitting maybe 2 from where Riley would be sitting during the game. And Michelle sat right behind that. And I turned around and looked at Michelle, and she was sobbing. And I remember talking to her after the game, and she told me that she felt like the Knicks finally had, even if it wasn't a player, the Knicks finally had someone like Bernard, who you would pay to see. If you weren't paying him to see, paying to see him play, you would pay to just watch Riley coach. That's how much of a striking figure he was at courtside. And she always told me that during the Riley years that, whenever her season ticket renewal was sent to her in the spring for the following fall, she would fill it out and sign the check and send it in before they could change their mind and take her seat away. Not that they would. But, no matter how much the price increase was, she felt like, that's how compelling the Riley years were at the Garden.
Did she ever develop relationships with opposing players or opposing coaches?
Well, usually the relationships that she developed were with the Knicks, but then players and coaches would go elsewhere. So like, Scott Brooks comes to mind. He played for the Knicks very briefly, but he was sitting on the end of the bench as a marginal pro. And so guys who sat on the bench tended to turn around and chit chat with the fans or come out and, before the game and shoot early before the stars would come out. And they also would kibitz with the fans, the early arriving fans. And so she developed a friendship with Scott Brooks. And in all the years that he was coaching, he went on to become, a fairly successful coach with the Oklahoma City Thunder. And now I believe he's in Washington. He would always come over and give her a hug after the game. Doc Rivers, who also played for the Knicks and then went on to coach any number of teams, always, she knew Doc lived up in Greenwich when Michelle obviously lived in Stanford. So she would run into him at various places and, restaurants, things of that nature. So she got to know a lot of those people. A lot of the players of the 80s and 90s who would come back and hang around, whether it was John Starks, who was employed at the Garden, or Charles Smith, Charles Oakley, before he got tossed out of there, another proud moment in the Dolan history. These are all people who, she had relationships with. So in their post-playing years, they always made it made a point to come say hello to her. It was one of the people who sat behind Michelle with his wife for many years, told me that he once asked her, do you come here to watch a game or to take attendance? Because there were so many people who were constantly coming up to Michelle just to give her a hug and chat about, whether it was a sports columnist like George Vesey, my former colleague at the Times. She had this really close relationship with Mark Jackson's mother based on an episode where the Garden fans were getting all over Mark for something stupid that he had said in the media. And Michelle, who loved Mark, she loved his his passing ability. She loved players who, you know, the cliche is they make everyone better. Mark was that kind of player because he had such great court vision. And Michelle loved him. So in anticipation of everyone booing him, she wrote up a sign, and when he was introduced in the starting lineup, and everybody did, I'd say everybody, but you know, thousands of people were booing him, she held up his sign that said, because his quote was like, you know, the fans are, somebody asked him, the fans are all over you or whatever. And he said, yeah, they're like rats deserting a sinking ship. And Michelle's sign said, Jax's rats never leave the ship. And she held it up, and it wound up on the back page. The photographer of the Daily News wound up taking a shot of it, and it wound up on the back page, you know, of the players lined up, Mark standing there with his arms behind his back, and Michelle holding up her sign. After that, Marie Jackson, who Mark's mother, never attended a game without first wandering across the floor from where she sat to give Michelle a hug and a kiss.
What would Michelle have said, Harvey, about NBA basketball in a bubble during the COVID crisis?
I think it would have wounded her. One of the things that she, you know, as she aged, and her health was deteriorating, although her doctors didn't seem to know what the problems really were until the very end. She really struggled with surrendering her seats. She had had these seats for so long, she almost felt like, I mean, she did feel like it was really a part of her identity, that she was the woman behind the bench, literally behind her guys, right? Spike Lee is out front, self-branding, you know, wearing the caps from his movie. Michelle was behind her team. And she used to always tell me, you know, I just dread when I'm no longer going that there will be, you know, these fans who, you know, they'll become like real corporate seats and just be passed out to people who are just there to be seen or to hand out their business cards or to be on their cell phones all night saying, oh, John McEnroe's sitting, you know, he's across the court from me, and Spike Lee is talking to Ethan Hawke. And, you know, she really hated that kind of fan. And increasingly, the real fans were being priced out. So they were disappearing all around her. So I think, you know, the idea that, you know, that the NBA arena, courtside, is, I think, without a doubt, the most intimate place in sports, right? Probably the most expensive as well, but the most intimate place. You literally can reach out and touch, you know, the players. You can hear the sneakers squeaking. You can, you know, see the look in their eyes when they miss a shot. You know, the joke was Van Gundy, when I called him to write Michelle's obituary, he said that many times, in direct contrast to the perfectly dressed Pat Riley with every hair in place, that Jeff would come out. Jeff was the everyman if Riley was the perfect man, and Jeff would come out all rumpled. And Michelle would often just step forward from her seat before a game and just fix the crooked collar on his sport jacket and just sit back down without saying a word. So, you know, again, that intimacy. And I think it would have been painful to her to watch those games on television where there were no fans at all, or that Zoom was the turnstile into an NBA arena where you had those Zoom fans on video screens. I think the whole thing she would have found it depressing. Frankly, I found most of sports viewing to be depressing, you know, through the summer and into fall, because, you know, if sports is supposed to be anything, it's supposed to be escapism from, you know, reality. And every time you look at, you know, cardboard cutouts in the seats behind home plate, or, you know, empty tennis stadiums, you know, you couldn't escape reality. And I think that would have been hard for her.
Is there a lesson in this book, Harvey? Is there a takeaway that the reader should take from the book?
Well, I think there, you know, in the responses I've gotten from a lot of readers, people I know and people I don't know, contact me via email or however. The book seems to be speaking to them in different ways. So I know a guy who worked at the Detroit Free Press for many years, and he said that he most related to the things that I wrote about the struggles and the ups and downs of my career. And it tapped into a lot of feelings that he had, you know, when he had similar situations. I think the one that intrigued me the most, the theme that ran through the book that intrigued me the most, was the one that I think Michelle and I were experiencing simultaneously during that last season. Michelle, because she was losing the avocational joy of her life, which was going to these games. And me, because, you know, in 2016, I stepped away from daily journalism. And I think for the first year after that, mainly because of an editor I was very close to who was still working at the Times, I still wrote a lot. I still write occasionally for the paper. But by 2017-18, which is the last season, I started to write a lot less. And I think it's natural when, you know, you do something for 40 years, whether it's, you know, something that's a hobby or something that's to make a living, and you stop doing it, the first thought that comes to mind is, well, now who am I? And I think grappling with that, you know, she had already gone through that career-wise because her career kind of fizzled out in her late 60s for a variety of reasons. But we kind of were going through that, you know, that severing of a strong connection to something we'd been connected to for a long time. And I explore that a lot, particularly in the second half of the book. And let's face it, all of us, you know, at some point in time have to deal with that. Whether it's something as simple as, hey, you know, the thing I love most in life is playing tennis, but then you can't play anymore because your knees won't allow it or your back won't allow it. You know, especially in a time like now where many people have lost their jobs, and, you know, and fear whether or not they'll be able to get back into their chosen professions. That's a theme that runs through this book that I think is something that is really important. And, you know, I'm still kind of struggling with that whole notion of, you know, how much do I want to continue writing? Do I want to do something different with my life in the remaining years I have? So I would say that particular theme. The others are, you know, the value of deep friendship, mentorship, the mutual love of something that's shared. And, but I would say the one about essentially aging and identification.
We do have some questions rolling in from our audience. What playoff games stand out in your mind, Harvey, during the Ewing era?
Well, you know, 1993, and this is something that Michelle never forgave me for. In 1993, the Knicks had a better record than Chicago Bulls, and many people thought that that was the year they were going to beat the Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals and advance to the finals to play against what would have been Phoenix. And during the Knicks won game one at home, and at halftime of game two, my former colleague at the Times, Dave Anderson, wandered over to me at halftime and he said, there's a guy sitting behind me, and he was sitting on the baseline on the other side of the court from where I was. So there's a guy yelling at Jordan, you know, Michael, is your arm tired? You know, did you stay out too late last night in Atlantic City? You know, are you tired from all that blackjack? And he said, I don't know who it is, but he's sure he's been on Michael the whole game. So I wandered over, and I knew the two guys who sat in the front row, these two lifers at the Garden, sort of like Michelle. One of them was the owner of the old Carnegie Deli, Fred Klein. And I said, who's yelling at Michael? And he pointed out to a guy who was like in the 7th row. And I walked up there and he looked at me like, what took you so long? And he told me that he had been in Atlantic City, the night before, and he saw Jordan there at like 2:00 in the morning. Now this is on game night or the night before a game. And so I go back and I tell Dave, what the guy had told me. Dave had been, he had been he had written about boxing for many years, and he knew a lot of people in Atlantic City. Well, by the next afternoon, Dave had run down the casino, the time Jordan had checked into the hotel, the time he had checked out, how much money he had lost playing blackjack. And he wrote a column questioning Jordan's commitment to the Bulls if he had been off in Atlantic City gambling the night before a big game. I wrote a news story, calling around to other people. And Jordan, they wound up losing that game. So they were down 2-0 in the series. The stories ran not the next morning, but the following morning as the series shifted to Chicago. And Jordan shut down the media completely, he was so furious that he wouldn't talk to anybody for the rest of the series. And of course, Jordan being an alpha male, destroyed the Knicks over the next 4 games. The Bulls won the series, went on to win the championship, denying the Knicks their best chance and last chance really to beat Michael Jordan. And of course, Michelle, I remember her telling me, Harvey, I love you dearly, but how could you? And of course, that was the one time where she didn't want to understand. Michelle understood the role of a journalist is to get the story, right? But that was the one time where the fan in her completely overwhelmed the quote unquote journalist in her. And I don't think she quite ever forgave me for it.
Did Michelle's sons develop a love of the Knicks like their mother?
In the book, as I said earlier, Michelle raised these 5 children on her own. There were some years that were very difficult before she really got her corporate career going. And I think her children, particularly her sons, because once she did get her career going, she was traveling a lot. And then when she was home, she was in New York a lot at Knicks games. She was a woman in her 40s at that point, certainly when I met her, I think early to mid 40s. And so she certainly deserved to have a social life, but she was away from her children a lot. And I think they sort of had a love-hate relationship with basketball because, on the one hand, they both were sports-minded sons. And I think one of her sons was actually a very good athlete and played basketball in high school. And his 2 sons, Michelle's grandchildren, were really good high school basketball players. One actually played at Clark University, which was another thing that connected us because my younger son went to Clark University and he was on the club basketball team. So he knew Michelle's grandson. And that was sort of a sweet thing that happened late in our friendship. But I think that, they liked basketball. They would attend games with her. Christmas was one day. The Knicks always had a Christmas Day game. And Michelle often, would like to bring one of her sons or daughters or grandsons in later years to the games to kind of show them off to all the people who knew her. But I think it was a conflicted kind of relationship that they had with it because, they were young and their father pretty much had abandoned them. And in the book, there is a lot of, Michelle's last year and a half of her life, dealing with, talking to me and dealing with a lot of her own regrets, the things that she felt she hadn't done well as a mother. It's all part and parcel of, how I was able to give back to Michelle for all the times she had helped me struggle through my own crises growing up. As a young adult. But I would say it was a somewhat conflicted relationship with basketball for the 2 boys.
Can you share your best memories of Linsanity, please?
Yeah, I thought, again, this was something, that was brief, relatively brief, because remember his coming out, kind of coincided with an injury to Carmelo Anthony. And so the Knicks needed somebody to kind of fill that void of the player who handled the ball the most. And it came so fast and out of nowhere that I remember one night, on Friday night, where he dominated the Lakers and Kobe Bryant at the Garden. And people were beside themselves with joy. Like, it was sort of reminded me a little bit of the brief Bernard King era, because, during the night Bernard scored 60 points on Christmas night, I remember going down to the bar to meet Michelle after it, and there was this buzz like, hey, we've got our guy now. We've got our Larry Bird, our Magic Johnson. I think people wanted to believe that, but it was really too good to be true. And I remember being in Florida doing some spring training baseball for the Times, and the Knicks went down to Miami to play the Heat. And, LeBron, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, they'd been hearing about all this phenomenon, this Jeremy Lin, and they kind of like just ganged up on him, and he had a horrible game. I think he shot 1 for 8 and committed 8 turnovers, and, kind of reality set in, because people were like saying things like, should he be on the Olympic team next summer? And it got totally out of hand. But, for those 2 or 3 weeks that he was on that role, I think what people really felt great about, and I know Michelle felt this way, was that we've got a homegrown guy. The Knicks were famous or infamous, or however you want to describe it, for, going out and buying some other player and being unable to develop their own stars, be it because they draft poorly, or they don't have the patience, or because there was so much front office turnover, as I mentioned earlier. And I think for those 2 or 3 weeks, people were like, could this be? Could we have just unearthed this gem that nobody suspected, was worth anything? And then the kind of Carmelo came back, and he resented the offense, revolving around Jeremy Lin, and he went to Dolan and said, I'm your guy, I'm your star. And then one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, Jeremy Lin was no longer in New York. Again, another part of tortured Knicks history.
Well, we are, believe it or not, already at that time. I can't believe this hour has flown right on by. So I want to take an opportunity to thank you, Harvey and Richard, for your time tonight and being with us. The conversation was fantastic, and I'm just so thrilled you were able to be with us this evening.
Well, thank you. First, let me thank RJ Julia for hosting this event, and also Richard. I so much appreciate doing this with you, and I hope to see you at a live event in the not too distant future, maybe in stores at a UConn women's game. I know we used to run into each other up there.
Or maybe at RJ Julia when you do your next book.
There we go.
And also, I want to thank everybody who's been watching, listening to this event. I appreciate it. And I hope we brought some basketball and Michelle Musler warmth to a snowy night.
Yes, all Our Last Season, A Writer, a Fan, and a Friendship by the great Harvey Araton is out now. It is available for purchase at RJ Julia Booksellers and Wesleyan RJ Julia Bookstore, online, over the phone, or in store, whatever you are most comfortable with. Signed book plates are available while supplies last. Thank you all for being with us this evening, and thank you, as always, for supporting your local independent bookstores. It means the world to us. Happy reading all, and have a fantastic night.